Get your black asses off my property. Your kind is a blight on my investment. Now clear out, or the police will remove you. The words sliced the quiet morning air. Tuesday morning. Michael Waller stood frozen on his porch, a retired man who had never raised his voice in 75 years. 30 years of perfect tenancy, a life built on honor, and a white boy half his age just called him garbage. Edward Webb, the spoiled heir, blocked their path, holding the fabricated eviction notice like a battle flag. Webb pointed aggressively, a posture that spoke of the inherited power he was so sure of. He sneered at Michael's quiet dignity. You think because you've been here 30 years you're exempt? This building is for my demographic now. People who pay market rate. People who look like me. You two are just a sad, ugly footnote. He gestured toward the police officer and the cold, unmoving figure in the marine fatigues he had brought to intimidate them. Agnes stood beside Michael. She didn't cry, but the shock was worse, a deep, trembling fear that erased the light from her eyes. Michael tightened his grip on her hand. He looked at the supposed law and the supposed military honor standing by, allowing this grotesque humiliation. But here is the critical thing: Edward Webb, with all his money and inherited privilege, was too arrogant to check. This elderly black couple had an adopted son. And that son, a decorated, ruthless U.S. Marine officer, was coming home. Hi, my beautiful family. Let's start with a blessing. Dear Lord, I ask you to surround every person watching with peace, healing, and endless love. Amen. You are not just an audience. You are my family, the reason I push through on the hardest days. For those who are new here, welcome to the family. Please subscribe, say hello in the comments, and let's grow closer together. Each story I bring is my sacrifice and devotion. When you walk away early, it feels like my heart is left unheard. Please, stay with me through the journey until the very end. I love you always. Now let us begin. 1 week before that terrible Tuesday morning, Apartment 2A, Ridgewood Heights, told the story of a lifetime lived with enduring love and discipline. Every framed certificate, every church photo, every medal Michael keeps in a quiet box. They were all memories worth more than gold. Every scar on the wall marked a life lived and cherished. Michael sat in his favorite recliner. The morning sunlight fell warm and golden. He turned the pages of his veterans magazine slowly, savoring his coffee, enjoying the peaceful quiet of another ordinary day in their sanctuary. An article caught his attention and made him pause. Housing discrimination on the rise. Landlords using underhanded tactics. Targeting the elderly who couldn't fight back. Michael shook his head slowly with a heavy sigh. Not here, he thought. Not after 30 years of faithfulness. Agnes hummed a hymn in the kitchen. Her voice was soft, melodic, like it had been for the 50 years of their marriage. This apartment was their refuge, their home where love lived in every corner and every memory. On the living room mantel, an object of devotion, a photograph that meant more to them than all the others combined. A young white man in his full marine dress blues, a man forged in fire and discipline, smiling with fierce pride and love, his arms wrapped tight around Michael and Agnes. A small label beneath it read in Agnes's careful handwriting, Henry, Quantico graduation, 2010. Agnes paused by the photograph, touching it gently with her fingertips. The memory of the boy they saved, and the man he became. Michael Waller didn't just live in his apartment, he stood watch over it. His retirement came after 20 years with the city's sanitation department. But before that, there were 4 years in the army, then another 20 working in the post office, a total of 44 years of quiet, thankless, essential labor. Michael's honor was not a loud, boastful thing. It was in the consistency of his wake-up time, the precision of his tools, and the fact that he never, not once in 30 years, paid his rent 1 minute past the first of the month. His tenancy record was spotless, a testament to a life lived without debt or drama. Agnes, 72, was his anchor. Where Michael was quiet steel, Agnes was the gentle warmth that softened the edges. For nearly 3 decades, she ran the local community pantry, coordinating volunteers and stretching slim budgets to feed those who fell through the cracks. Her work was her ministry, and every neighbor, black or white, young or old, knew her smile and her unwavering reliability. Their apartment was a reflection of their lives, meticulously clean, deeply rooted, and full of quiet purpose. Henry Waller, the man in the marine photograph, was the pride of this deeply rooted life. They hadn't sought him out, but fate brought the white, troubled 9-year-old boy to their door through the foster system. Henry was a handful, angry, defensive, lost. He carried the confusion of a child who had never known stable ground. Agnes gave him a place to land. Michael gave him a code. They taught him that discipline was the highest form of self-respect, and that honor had no color. When Henry eventually chose the U.S. Marine Corps, it was a profound testament to the structure and fierce loyalty the Wallers had instilled in him. He had traded the chaos of his youth for the ultimate oath of service. The Wallers held a simple, fierce belief: duty above all else. It was a belief that Henry absorbed and escalated. He didn't become just a Marine. He rose through the ranks as an officer, decorated multiple times, known in the intelligence community for his ruthless efficiency in problem-solving and his absolute, unwavering commitment to mission success. He didn't see walls or barriers. He saw objectives and obstacles. To Edward Webb, the landlord, Michael and Agnes Waller were a financial problem to be erased. To Henry Waller, the Marine, Michael and Agnes were his parents, his bedrock, his home. And any threat to home, any threat to the foundation of his existence, was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of war. That was the unstated, terrifying oath Henry had carried with him around the globe. And now, it was about to be deployed on a quiet doorstep in their small city. The apartment felt different after the confrontation, but it had always been a refuge. Michael and Agnes, having suffered years of trying for a child only to be met with loss, had finally turned their boundless capacity for nurturing toward the foster system. They weren't looking for a race or a reflection of themselves. They were looking for a life to love. They found Henry. He arrived at 9 years old, a skinny, sharp-eyed white boy with a knot of anger deep in his chest. Henry had bounced through multiple homes, always feeling like a mistake, a stray dog, particularly in some of the predominantly white families where he'd felt invisible. But in the care of Agnes and Michael, the irony of the situation was the first lesson in acceptance. Henry expected pity or confusion. He received fierce, uncompromising love. He struggled early on. His teachers whispered about his temperament, and the neighborhood kids, regardless of race, were often cruel, confused by the strange racial dynamic of the Waller family. Henry fought constantly, fueled by his deep, raw feeling of being unwanted. Michael, a man of few words, used discipline not as punishment, but as a pathway to self-control. Every night, they didn't just read history, they discussed honor. They didn't just pray, they discussed the oath, the sacred promises a person makes to their community and to themselves. Michael taught him how to use a wrench, how to fix things that were broken. Agnes taught him that a home was more than just a roof. It was a promise. Their quiet, unflinching belief in his inherent goodness chipped away at the boy's anger. When Henry, still a teenager, announced he was joining the Marines, Michael didn't argue. He only said, "If you're going to take an oath, you keep it, son. No matter the cost." The Corps gave Henry the structure he craved, but the discipline had already been forged in the Wallers' apartment. He excelled not just because of his physical ability, but because of his calculated focus and absolute loyalty. He became a man who could separate the emotional noise from the objective, a man who saw injustice not as a societal flaw, but as a mission failure. He never forgot where he came from, the two black people who chose him when no one else would. To Henry, the debt was not to the nation, but to the hands that raised him. Now, decades later, when his parents' dignity was under threat, Henry's Marine training, the precision, the ruthless efficiency, the overwhelming force, was no longer reserved for foreign battlefields. It was dedicated to a single, essential domestic mission, neutralizing the threat on Apartment 2A. He was ready to deploy everything they had taught him, and everything the Corps had sharpened, to protect the two people who had pulled him out of the fire. Edward Webb was not a landlord. He was a beneficiary. He was 32, spoiled, and wholly convinced that the world, including his newly inherited apartment building, existed purely to facilitate his comfort and wealth. His father had been a pragmatic, if stern, man who saw steady rent from long-term tenants like the Wallers as the bedrock of stable income. Edward saw them as dead weight, a remnant of a previous era whose below-market rent was insulting to his ledger. The Wallers' apartment, 2A, sat in a prime corner of the building, a unit Edward believed could command a 40% premium if only it were empty, scrubbed of its history, and marketed to a trendier demographic. That was the motive, pure, greedy impatience. He couldn't wait for Michael and Agnes to naturally vacate. They were too healthy, too deeply rooted. He needed to manufacture a crisis. His inciting incident was calculated and dishonest. He ordered a small, unnecessary maintenance project in the neighboring unit, knowing it would cause minor, temporary damage to the plumbing leading to the Wallers' bathroom. He then hired a consultant, a friend of a friend with a questionable certification, to conduct an immediate, unannounced inspection of the Wallers' unit, claiming it was for routine structural assessment. The consultant, heavily compensated, ignored the actual source of the damage and instead cited a minor, localized water stain on the ceiling as a severe, unaddressed structural deficiency, demanding immediate, non-negotiable relocation. This was the lie. It allowed Webb to bypass normal eviction procedures. He didn't use noise complaints or late payments, which were easily refuted. He used a fabricated safety hazard, leveraging the bureaucratic language of building codes to make his attack seem legitimate and urgent. He wanted them to panic and leave voluntarily, saving him the cost and hassle of a drawn-out legal fight. He was confident in his arrogance. Who were they, an elderly couple, to question a stamped, official-looking document detailing imminent structural failure? They were just two quiet, elderly black people, after all. They wouldn't know the difference. They wouldn't fight back. He was certain they were invisible. He was dangerously, fatally wrong. The official-looking envelope arrived on a Wednesday, tucked discreetly between the utility bills and the junk mail. It was thick, heavy with the weight of officialdom, and sealed with a corporate stamp. Michael didn't even open it in the entryway, carrying it directly to the kitchen table, the center of their life, where Henry had done his homework and where they signed their checks. The moment he broke the seal, the kitchen's warm light seemed to dim. The paper was aggressive, filled with legal jargon, notice to vacate. It cited imminent safety hazards and non-compliant structural deficiencies, referencing the fabricated findings of Edward Webb's paid consultant. The language was calculated to instill panic, giving them a dangerously short time frame to relocate. Agnes, who rarely wavered, read the key paragraphs over Michael's shoulder, and the sheer audacity of the lie fractured her composure. "Deficiencies?" she whispered, running a trembling hand over the impeccably clean tile counter. 30 years, Michael. 30 years of perfection. They're saying we failed. They're erasing us with a lie. The eviction notice wasn't just a threat to their housing. It was an erasure of their lifetime of honest effort. The core of her identity, the stability and sanctuary she created, was being shattered by a spoiled brat's greed. The weight of the world they had always kept at bay pressed down on them. Michael felt the familiar surge of fierce, old soldier pride. He was not helpless, and he was certainly not garbage. He had faced difficult people and hard truths before. He would handle this. He would find the right lawyer, the right city official, someone who would recognize his honor and expose Webb's fraud. He carefully tucked the notice into a file, determined to build a solid defense. When Henry called later that evening, his voice booming and cheerful from a base thousands of miles away, Michael kept his voice steady. Henry always asked about the apartment, the sanctuary, he remembered. "Everything all right, Dad?" Henry asked, detecting a slight lag in Michael's usual response. Michael looked at the file tucked beneath the newspapers, the threat of physical presence in the room. He thought about Henry, the decorated officer, the sharp mind, the powerful reach. But he also remembered the vow he'd made to himself. He would not rely on his son's success to save him. He would not let Henry's busy, essential life be interrupted by his parents' domestic squabble. Asking for help felt like an admission of failure, a betrayal of the strong foundation he had promised Henry. "Everything's fine, Henry," Michael lied, his voice a little too loud, a little too firm. "Just fine. Stay safe, son." He offered an order of retreat to his own problems, determined to manage the battle alone, completely underestimating the ruthlessness and depth of his enemy. The initial shock of the eviction notice was quickly replaced by a grinding, relentless campaign of psychological warfare waged by Edward Webb. He realized the initial notice hadn't prompted the immediate retreat he craved, so he escalated. The structural assessment crew he'd paid off became a permanent fixture on the property, but only near apartment 2A. They weren't performing repairs. They were performing harassment. The noise began precisely at 7 a.m. and didn't cease until 9 p.m. The constant, deliberate clang of dropped tools, the whine of saws that cut nothing, and the endless, vibrating thump of unseen machinery. Michael, a man whose life had always been governed by order, found his routine shredded. His morning coffee was consumed to the sound of a jackhammer. His afternoon rest was obliterated by shouts and simulated construction. Then came the more insidious acts of cruelty. On a damp, cold Tuesday night, their heat suddenly died. Webb's assistant, a nervous young man, claimed it was an unfortunate, temporary sectional malfunction, but the power was only out for their corner of the building. Michael, ever the handyman, tried to fix the fuse box, but the problem was outside his control. Agnes spent the night wrapped in 3 blankets, shivering, her eyes wide and sleepless. Webb himself started making visits, usually just after dinner. He would loiter outside their window, talking loudly on his phone about his plans for the unit. Designer paint, granite countertops, a much younger, quieter clientele. He was trying to make them feel irrelevant, to wear down their stamina until they gave up, not out of legal necessity, but sheer exhaustion. The dignity Michael had clung to began to fray. He still maintained his daily routines, but his movements were slower, his back stooped with more than just age. Agnes, though, was his greatest concern. She stopped humming her hymns. She stopped tending her geraniums. The sanctuary was polluted. One evening, as Michael was struggling to fix a subtly damaged mailbox lock, another piece of pettiness from Webb's crew, his phone rang. It was Henry. "Hey, Pop. Just checking in," Henry said, his voice carrying the deep, calm authority Michael knew well. Michael automatically straightened his back, composing his face even though Henry couldn't see him. He could hear the low thrum of military chatter in the background, a reminder of the vital, complex work Henry was doing thousands of miles away. "We're fine, son." "Just fine," Michael replied, perhaps a little too quickly. Henry paused. The silence on the Marine's end was not empty. It was calculating. "You sound tired, Dad." "Everything quiet with the building." Michael glanced at the apartment, where Agnes sat silently beneath a dim lamp, the noise outside just having stopped. He thought of the eviction notice, the cold Tuesday night, and the constant throbbing tension. He swallowed the truth, a hard, bitter pill of pride and protection. He didn't want Henry's ruthless attention focused on a civilian matter. He wanted Henry focused on his mission. He would not burden the boy who had built such an impressive life from their simple love. "It's all clear, Henry. Just a little noise from some work on the unit next door. Nothing we can't handle. Now you focus on your mission, all right? Your mom sends her love." "Yes, sir," Henry replied, his tone professional, but with a subtle note of skepticism Michael didn't catch. "Tell Mom I love her. Be safe." Michael hung up, convinced he had deflected his son's suspicion. He returned to Agnes, having successfully preserved his independent struggle. He didn't realize that for a decorated Marine officer, "all clear" was a term reserved for absolute certainty, and any deviation in the tone of the report immediately registered as a threat. Henry hung up the phone thousands of miles away, the casual lie already noted and logged in the back of his tactical mind. He knew his father never lied unless the stakes were critical. The mission had just changed. The end came on a Tuesday. The fake construction noise had escalated to an unbearable pitch, and then, at 11 a.m., it stopped abruptly, replaced by a terrifying silence. Michael knew what was coming. He walked slowly to the door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the quiet steel of his resolve. Agnes followed, her hand clamped tight to his arm. When Michael opened the door, the image confrontation was fully staged. Edward Webb stood center, holding a thick sheaf of papers, the final, notarized eviction order. Flanking him were the 2 figures he'd hired for intimidation: the dour, stone-faced police officer and the imposing, silent Marine, who stood rigid, an unnerving statue of military force. They lent the scene an air of overwhelming, unquestionable official authority. Webb hadn't just manufactured a safety concern. He had manufactured a court-ordered reality. "Time's up, Michael," Webb drawled, his voice thick with satisfied malice. "No lawyers, no extensions, no more excuses. The city has ratified the structural risk. You're done. Michael stared back, his 75 years of dignity his only weapon. You're a liar, Webb. This is a sham. You're harassing us because of the color of our skin and the amount of our rent. Webb's face split into a cruel grin. He leaned close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for Michael. Of course it is, old man. And you know the beautiful irony? You can fight this in court, spend your whole savings, and you'll still lose. But since you mentioned color, do you think the law cares about you? Do you think your boy, that Marine who's probably off fighting some desert war, do you think he gives a damn about your little rent dispute? You're invisible. Then Webb glanced at Agnes, whose face was pale and drawn. He didn't just want them out, he wanted them destroyed. He gestured toward the Marine. See this man? He serves his country. And what do you two serve? You taught him about duty, right? Well, your duty now is to clear out quietly and let me clean up this blight. At least give the world that much. That was the breaking point. Michael could endure the lies, the noise, the cold. But when he looked at Agnes, he saw not the familiar pain, but absolute terror. Webb had successfully used the uniform, the very symbol of the honorable service Michael respected, to crush her spirit. He saw the defeat in his wife's eyes, the realization that their lifetime of respectability had been rendered meaningless by a rich boy's whim. His pride shattered instantly, replaced by the primal urge to protect. Michael backed slowly into the apartment, turning away from Webb's sneering face. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call the police. He found Henry's number, his son's call sign ringing in the silence of his ruined sanctuary. Webb called after him. What are you doing? Calling your lawyer? Too late for that, Waller. Michael ignored him. He brought the phone to his ear, his voice rough and wet with a lifetime of pent-up emotion and final surrender. He didn't offer a report or an explanation. He spoke the only words Henry, the decorated officer, would understand as an absolute, non-negotiable command. Son, I need you. Now. Address is the front door. The next morning, less than 36 hours after Michael's desperate plea, Henry Waller arrived. He didn't come in the uniform Michael remembered, but in a tailored dark suit that managed to be more intimidating than camouflage. His movements were economic, his expression focused and cold. The look of a man who had received his mission parameters and was executing them with surgical precision. The frantic, raw desperation in his father's voice had been the one truth that cut through all of Michael's proud lies. Henry knew instantly that the threat was existential, not merely legal. He didn't waste time on hugs or emotional reassurance. He first ensured Michael and Agnes were physically safe, then set up a temporary operations center in the Waller's small dining nook, quickly deploying the tools of his trade. While Webb had been staging his little eviction spectacle, Henry had already mobilized his network, a quiet, efficient back channel of intelligence analysts, retired military associates, and financial forensic experts he relied on for high-level counterintelligence work. Webb had assumed the Wallers would hire a local, slow-moving civil attorney. Henry, the Marine officer, did not argue civil law. He hunted the enemy's vulnerability. The rapid, excessive malice of the eviction campaign, combined with the property's value, suggested a weakness larger than simple gentrification. Henry ordered a full deep dive on Edward Webb's inherited finances, property shell corporations, and tax filings, a reconnaissance mission targeting Webb's economic infrastructure. The truth was laid bare in a matter of hours. Webb wasn't just lazy, he was fraudulent. The inheritance came with liabilities, and to cover them, Webb had been systematically running his properties through a complex, illegal scheme of tax evasion and fraudulent loan applications, vastly overstating maintenance costs, including the structural deficiency he blamed on the Wallers to siphon money. His entire operation was built on lies, and his desperate attempt to quickly flip the Wallers unit was simply to inject cash into the collapsing scheme. Henry made 2 quiet, strategic phone calls, not to the city court, but to the federal authorities, the IRS and the FBI. He didn't make a case, he delivered a package of overwhelming, unassailable evidence. He gave them the location, the target, and the timeline. The climax arrived not with shouting, but with silence. Edward Webb was in his main office, gloating over the thought of the Wallers' inevitable eviction. The door opened, not to Michael or Agnes, but to Henry, standing in the doorway like an avenging angel, blocking the exit. "Mr. Webb," Henry said, his voice level and dangerously quiet. "My name is Henry Waller. I'm Agnes and Michael's son." Webb sneered. "Another lawyer? You're too late, Sonny. I just signed the papers. You think a stern look is going to stop me?" Henry didn't change his expression. He simply slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Not a civil summons, but an official warrant. "No, sir. I think a 5-count federal indictment will." Webb paled, his arrogance instantly evaporating into fear. He began sputtering about property rights and lawyers, but before the words fully formed, the side door of his office swung open. 2 agents in dark suits, IRS and FBI, stepped in quiet, efficient, and lethal. They ignored Henry entirely, their mission parameters already set. "Edward Webb," the lead agent stated, his voice flat. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of felony tax evasion and wire fraud. Put your hands behind your back." The Marines' counterattack was complete. Webb was stunned, humiliated, and utterly ruined, his fate sealed not by a local housing dispute, but by the ruthless, uncompromising efficiency of a son protecting his home. Edward Webb's collapse was swift and total. The news of his arrest for multiple federal felonies, orchestrated by a complex network of evidence compiled in a single day, sent shockwaves through the local business community. The eviction order against the Wallers was immediately invalidated, exposed as a fraudulent instrument of his larger criminal enterprise. The spoiled heir was ruined, facing years of prosecution and the seizure of his assets, including the very building he had sought to gentrify. Henry Waller, the man who had executed the takedown, did not linger to enjoy the victory. His mission was complete, but his loyalty demanded one final act of protection. He spent the next day quietly working with a non-profit organization established by a fellow decorated veteran, a group dedicated to providing stable, affordable housing for elderly and low-income families. Using the full leverage of his legal and military connections, Henry ensured that the apartment building, now temporarily managed by federal receivers, would eventually be transferred to this non-profit entity. It was a guarantee that no Edward Webb could ever again use the property for exploitation. The Wallers' neighbors, those who had also suffered under the racist campaign, were suddenly safe, their homes secured by a Marine's unwavering sense of duty. That evening, the first moment of true peace returned to apartment 2A. The silence was profound, unbroken by the clanging of false construction. Agnes cooked a simple dinner, something savory and deeply familiar, and they ate at the small kitchen table, the eviction notice now a crumpled piece of useless paper in the trash. Henry was dressed casually, the marine focus replaced by the quiet, observant son. He sat across from his father, Michael, who pushed his food around his plate. After a long silence, Michael reached across the table and placed his hand on Henry's arm. "I tried to handle it alone, son," Michael said, his voice catching. The pride that had caused him to lie over the phone was finally extinguished, replaced by profound gratitude. He looked his Marine son in the eye, the strong, black father looking at the strong, white son he had raised. "I thought asking for help, that it was a sign of weakness. I thought I had to protect you from my fight." Henry simply shook his head. "Dad, you taught me the oath. You taught me that you don't leave anyone behind on the battlefield. When you called me, that wasn't weakness. That was a direct order. The highest order I've ever received." Michael's composure finally broke. He squeezed Henry's arm, tears tracing paths through the wrinkles around his eyes. "Courage," Michael whispered, "means knowing when to ask for backup." Agnes smiled, her light finally restored. The home was no longer just a physical structure. It was a testament to the family they had built. The crisis had revealed the depth of their love and the power of Henry's ruthless protection. The Wallers were safe, their legacy secure, standing proud on the foundation of their perfect tenancy and the unwavering loyalty of the Marine they had saved. They were home, secured by an oath kept.